Okay. Good evening and welcome. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out to this. And also, this is probably the fourth or fifth program we've done in this space, which is called the Keeping History Center. And for those of you who may have been in programs before COVID, we used to do them here, but we've put in new theatrical lighting and a movie screen, and we're going to do lots of programs here. For a crowd this size, as opposed to our theater, it feels just comfortable and intimate, which is what we're hoping for. So I'm Joshua Mack. I'm the museum's vice president of marketing and public programs. And it's really a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program, Nazis in New York. The program came together really very quickly as we wanted to mark the 85th anniversary, which was on the 20th, last week, of the pro-Nazi rally that took place at Madison Square Garden. I think it was also influenced somewhat by Rachel Maddow's Ultra podcast, which I was obsessed with, and now with her new book, Prequel, which expands on the podcast to share the history, some of which we'll hear about tonight. We're joined by three amazing documentarians. Peter Yost, whose Nazi Town USA is on PBS right now as part of the American Experience. He's produced in the past for Nova and National Geographic. Marshall Curry, in the middle, Academy Award nominee for Night at the Garden, and more recently for The Neighbor's Wife. And Daniel Lombroso, who I'm blocking, whose film White Noise is about his time undercover with present-day white supremacists, and we hope to show that at the museum in the near future. We've done other programs about Nazis in America and the fight against them, and you can find those on our YouTube channel, and we'll send you the links in the follow-up to this program. If you've had time to explore The Holocaust, What It Can Do, our exhibit on the first floor, there are several amazing stories in there, one of which is about Florence Menheim, who was a New York City public librarian, a Jewish woman who went undercover into Bund rallies all around New York, really showing amazing, amazing courage. So thank you again for coming out and being a member of the museum's community, and enjoy. Hope you have a very good experience tonight.
Wow. Hope everyone's feeling all right. I know that's a heavy 6 minutes. What a chilling film, what an incredible film. It was nominated for an Oscar several years ago. What's shocking to me is that this happened in our city. I had no idea that this happened. I imagine most people in the audience didn't know. When did you first discover this archival material, and what made you want to do something with it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm embarrassed to say I'd never heard of it either, and was at dinner with a friend of mine who's a screenwriter and was working on a screenplay that takes place in New York in 1939. And he told me about the rally, and I thought, no way, I would have heard of this. And he said, no, there was this 30-foot portrait of George Washington, and they filled Madison Square Garden. And I was like, no way, no way. And I went home that night and looked it up, and sure enough, he was right. And not only that, there were some documentaries, historical documentaries, that had some clips from the rally. And I thought, well, if there are a few seconds of this thing, there has to be more than that. And so I got in touch with a friend of mine who is an archival researcher and said, do you think you could try to find some of this footage? And so he started calling around. And there was some at the National Archive and some at UCLA's archive and Grinberg Archive. And there were sort of fragments of them, some of them from like old newsreels and some just like, fragments. Some of them had audio, but no, there were audio files, but no picture, and vice versa. And the National Archive had film that had never been scanned high resolution, high definition before. And so anyway, we sort of gathered all of that footage, which wasn't that much, and so I thought, okay, I'd love to do a documentary about this, because it feels frighteningly relevant, unfortunately. And so I was sort of playing around one night with the footage, and I had this idea that what if instead of interviewing people and explaining things, you just drop the audience into this world and let them puzzle it out? What would that feel like? And usually we watch movies and nobody tells you what's going on. You just sort of figure it out. And so I started sort of playing with this experience of just placing someone in that world. And Peter and I are old friends, and so I actually showed him a rough cut of the thing, and I said, do you think that this works just by itself? And he said, yeah, and so I reached out to Laura Poitras and Charlotte Cook, who at that point were running Field of Vision. They gave me some money and support, and we were able to do all those scans of high definition and do the color and the sound and get a composer and all of that.
I love that you just drop the audience in and you're forced to piece it together, and it just continues to escalate, where you see the American icons and at the end the silhouette of the Nazi salute, and then eventually get some exposition that there were 20,000 people there. We'll eventually talk about that historical period, but what was happening in America at the time that you made the film? It was, what, 2016, 2017? Was there something happening in the Trump years that maybe inspired you to make this?
Yeah, so, I mean, demagoguery is something that, humans have done to each other for thousands of years, from the Spartans to the Nazis to, all over the world. And it seemed to me like at that period, there were a lot of people who were taking power around the world and in the United States by attacking the press and demonizing people of minority religions and cheering the violence against protesters. And when Charlottesville happened, that was sort of the thing that made me think, this is not history. This is something that's threatening our country now. And so I thought just sort of sharing this piece of history without any sort of commentary, but just saying, this is a thing that happened. There was a point in America where we stood at a fork and we could have gone one way, and for a number of historical reasons, including Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor and Franklin Roosevelt being the president, we went the way that confronted Nazis. But that didn't have to happen. And so, I just thought, why don't we just make something? We'll put it out into the world. We had screenings all around the country. We put it on the internet. People pirated it. They shared it. People recut it and did things with it. And mostly, I just wanted for this point of our history to become sort of like the footage of, kids in the South protesting and being hosed down at protests, where it's an uncomfortable part of our history, but is an important thing for us to confront, and a cautionary tale about making bad choices and making mistakes.
We'll dig into the context in a bit, but the filmmaking is so strong, and as a filmmaker myself who's made a lot of bad movies and a few good movies, the good ones, you're specific in what you're trying to say. And I find the more I advance in my career, the less I shoot, and the more I know what I'm trying to say. How did you find something specific in this rally and make it as short as 6 minutes? What were you looking for, and how did you create that sense of mood? Because it's so powerful. I mean, you feel every image when you're watching it.
To me, the main takeaway, the thing that was the most shocking when I saw the footage, was how normal the people in the crowd looked. And I live in New York. I love New York. And it was just amazing to see people in their hats and their suits that had gone home from work, said hello to their neighbors, put their kids with the babysitter, and gone out to a rally where a speaker dehumanized people and cheered and laughed as somebody got beaten up on stage. And there's one shot that really caught my eye that I sort of reframed and zoomed on to hopefully catch people's attention. But there's a moment where there's a little boy in the crowd, and as the guys are beating up that protester, the little boy just rubs his hands together and he does this excited dance.
Yeah.
And to me, that moment said, we human beings are fallible creatures who can be stirred by funny, cruelty, leaders who riots and hate and cruelty can be thrilling.
Yeah.
And we need to be aware of that if we're going to push back on it in a competent way. The way that that ideology of scapegoating Jews, attacking immigrants, could all, attacking the press, could all be wrapped in the symbols of America also, was just so jarring to me. Our country's founded on a First Amendment about free press and free speech and free to worship who you want, and we're a country of immigrants from around the world, and yet all of those symbols could be, in my mind, distorted to cloak an ideology that is very anti-American.
And the euphoria you see in the crowd is not dissimilar from what we'd see at, our former president's rallies. Not that it was the same level of extremism, but there was this article in The Atlantic that with Trump, the cruelty was the point. And I think that that's something that you witnessed there, that kid, the shot of the kid jumping and shaking his hands is something that always stood out to me.
Yeah.
That there's real exuberance in cruelty.
Yeah. And I don't want to say Trump is a Nazi. I don't think he's a Nazi,
No,
and I think that the Nazis were a uniquely horrific group of people, but I think that the power of demagoguery to stir us up against each other is the thing that we should be careful about.
Exactly. Peter, I know you've worked with Marshall. You're friends with Marshall. I just learned you're college friends with Marshall.
Right.
Your film, and we'll see clips from it shortly, gets at the broader context. Can you just kind of set up what was happening in America at the time, what was happening in New York that made this rally possible?
Sure, and also I should just, as I watched Marshall's great film in its early phases, and finally, it was driving me crazy because I think it's great, and I think it was a really smart idea to drop it out there like that, but I had so many questions. If this is what's happening inside Madison Square Garden, 20,000 of these people are gathered, what the heck is going on in the country at large? And so I think they are actually, it's the first time we've done this publicly, but I think they are excellent companion pieces, and my project was literally born out of that question, which in turn was born out of that frustration and admiration for Marshall's focused approach. And so our film, or my film, Nazi Town, USA, sets out really to set the stage and to engage the broader political, social landscape of America in the 1920s and 30s, and kind of ask why America was potentially fertile ground for a number of right-wing, potentially even fascist ideas. Again, always jumping off from that animating original question, what the heck is going on with 20,000 of these people? So what was the state of America? And what we kind of, as we turned over more and more rocks, what was perhaps most striking to me was it's easy to look at this from where we sit in the present day. Historians call this presentism, where you take what we know happened in history and we apply it back, and one sees a swastika and of course has presumably negative or strong associations with that and with fascism. But at the time, these weren't quite as loaded as they, of course, are today. This course, this path, this right-wing or even fascist path, was a possible course that America was going to take, and it seemed a reasonable option to some people in America. And it seemed that, in large part, what we kind of discovered, because of what happened in the 20s and 30s and what to some degree was in the DNA of America. It's very comforting to think of, and of course the Nazis are a German organization and an import in a sense, and that this is something that existed over there, and how did it come over here to infect us here in America? But the harsh reality, the uglier truth arguably, is that a number of the ideas that resonated deeply with the folks that we see in Marshall's film and in turn in mine, a number of those ideas were deeply embedded in America in the 1920s and 30s, whether they be Jim Crow laws, which were an inspiration ultimately for the Nuremberg laws that the Nazis passed. In fact, they found some of the state statutes in America to be too extreme for their liking, the way that we differentiated between races, and so they watered those down in some instances, or extremely extreme immigration acts, like in 1924, where we gave primacy to whites over pretty much everyone else coming to America, and the anti-Semitism that was endemic in America at the time. A number of things that existed already in this country were in place and resonated with people. And so it's comforting to perhaps, again, think of this as a foreign import or something that came here and infected us. But in fact, what we found that at the time, especially heightened on the heels of the Great Depression, which created great economic uncertainty and fear and dislocation, people were really searching for something else, and they fell back on some of these uglier elements that were deeply a part of America.
Something I find so interesting that the film illustrates is the flexibility of anti-Semitism. That, you know, I grew up knowing about the Jews are bankers, or the Jews, but here it's Jewish Moscow. It's that the Jews are the communists. Can you talk about the kind of the role of anti-Semitism and Judaism among the German American Bund, how they utilized it?
I think it's remarkable, and without getting into the present day, I think it continues very much today. Whatever one's position on Israel and Gaza, and we're not going to talk about that, I'm sure, or I'm sure not, even though I just mentioned it, but it's amazing to me that whatever one's position, there's kind of a one-size-fits-all, whipping post, if you will. And an example back then was literally in the footage that we had, and we dug up a lot more footage ultimately than Marshall had, because he was working with this particular rally. As you'll see perhaps in some of the clips that we'll play from my film, it looks at the Bund as an organization outside of Madison Square Garden as well in a broader context. So sadly, we spent a lot of time marinating in their leader Fritz Kuhn's speeches beyond Madison Square Garden. And what's remarkable is exactly what you say. He'll go on for a while about the Bolshevik, Jewish, blah, blah, left-wing threat that these essentially communist Jews pose, and then without even taking a breath, switches to, the harsh reality that the Jewish capitalists are pulling the strings of big finance, with no awareness of the kind of intellectual collision there, or dislocation. And so again, I think that's something at that moment, again today, and arguably pretty much any place in the world at any point in history, it is remarkable to me how, you can always blame it on a Jew.
Yeah, and I think we'll avoid discussing the war, but the word colonizer would be the obvious one that's coming up now.
Yeah, I'm not talking about that.
I think we can go to the first clip from Peter's film. Very powerful. Who was Fritz Kuhn? I wasn't familiar with him before watching your film, either of your films. Who was he, and what did he want? Because as they mentioned in the film, I mean, America, even at the time, was a was not as diverse as it is now, but it was a diverse country. It wasn't, a white continent like Europe, even if it was mostly. Who was he, and what was his aspiration here?
Well, as briefly mentioned there, he had been a gunner, so kind of a grunt, if you will, in World War I for Germany, obviously fighting on the German side. They lost, of course, the Treaty of Versailles and the harsh reparations. Germany was in incredible ruin, economically, socially, and Kuhn was basically a guy like probably millions of other men who wanted to create a life for themselves somehow. He ended up emigrating to America via Mexico. We don't really, that's a whole other story. Somebody should make the movie of that, where he ends up in Mexico for a year and a half. But with the goal, ultimately, which he achieved, of coming to America. And he came, not by chance, to work in a hospital that was owned by Henry Ford, who, as many know, was, among other things, the notorious anti-Semite. It was a hospital that allowed no Jewish doctors. Kuhn worked there for a while to get his feet under him and started to become involved in kind of German American affairs. There was an organization called Friends of New Germany that had been formed in the 1934-35, which organized across America, which were essentially first-generation Germans and some who had been here longer, who had an allegiance at that time to the Nazi Party, and that had a strong connection, direct connection to the government in Germany. And Kuhn kind of had a foot in that world, and they started to hold rallies and march and do all of these sorts of things. And Hitler got wind of it, needless to say, and thought that it was bad politics. He thought that it was going to galvanize American opposition to what he was doing and upset and draw attention at the time where he didn't want to draw the attention of the American government and the American people. And so Hitler actually ordered the shutting down of this group, and Kuhn at that point had been gradually getting more and more involved in these sorts of things and saw an opportunity. And he resuscitated this defunct group basically after Hitler shut down Friends of New Germany in 1936. Kuhn created what was called the German American Bund, and he took a number of the ideas and made it a quote-unquote American organization. So as we see in Marshall's clips, the giant posters of George Washington, who Kuhn, for no reason, but referred to as the original fascist. And he basically just made up history. They did rallies where, and we might see this in a clip, but in many, many ways they wrapped themselves in the American flag, literally and metaphorically. And so Kuhn became the essential absolute leader of the Bund, which, by the way, was headquartered in New York City, on the Upper East Side in Yorkville. And there were scores, I think nearly 100 chapters across the country, pretty much everywhere in the United States, and he had people who would go out and oversee the regional chapters, but he was based in New York as the national head, and we follow his rise and ultimate fall through the movie.
Kuhn is the one who, of course, gets up in Marshall's film. I'm sure you spent a lot of time with that tape, and it's really powerful when you see this guy get up and what's he going to say, and he's so explicit. What do you think gave him his power? Why did people respond to him? And what were you looking for as a filmmaker? I'm sure he spoke for 30 minutes or an hour. How did you know what to focus on or what to select?
I guess I was looking for things that I wanted to include enough of what he said to give people a clear understanding that what their ideology was, without giving him too much of a platform to spend a lot of time on it. So I guess I was looking for things that resonated, that felt like something that you might see today. And I mean, it's interesting, the whole sort of Germanness of what he said, I think was in some ways what initially gave him power, but also sort of put a ceiling on the power. That there was only so much selling of this ideology that could be done when you had such a thick German accent and when it had German trappings as well. And I think that's one of the things that is so frightening to me today about the alt-right and the sort of new Nazi movement is that they are very American. They don't have German accents. They know exactly how to play with internet memes. They're funny and clever and charismatic in a way that's extremely effective. And I think there's a famous line that when fascism comes to America, it won't have a label that says "Made in Germany." It won't have a swastika. It won't have a German accent. It'll just, and it probably won't even be called fascism. It'll just be called Americanism. And that's something I think in your film a lot as well, that you explore the kind of Americanness of that movement.
Yep.
I think it's actually a good opportunity to go to the next clip because it's about that exactly.
Oh, sorry to step on that. Yeah, excuse me.
If you want to cue the next one. We always get one clap. Everyone should clap. It's funny to go to questions because the film does such a good job of explaining this stuff, but Star-Spangled Fascism is such a catching phrase. Can you kind of just expand on what that means and sort of the contradictions that lie within it?
Right. I think what strikes me about it, in part, is the boldness of it And it's kind of scary. I mean, it is scary, and it's sobering to me as somebody who furrows, I have glasses and I furrow my brow and I try to think myself through things and what is right and what is true, and to research and quadruple check things, and let's get to the core of what is really going on. And these guys just make it up. George Washington's the original fascist, and let's make the poster 50 feet tall instead of 20 feet, and people respond to that. And so I find that deeply kind of existentially unsettling and perhaps relevant today. It strikes me as, unenlightened, literally, and anti-enlightenment in a sense. And so on just seeing that even here, I just find it actually scary. I mean, I could say all kinds of things about what they appropriated and how they did it, but it's probably that underlying move and just the baldness of it that is scary to me, or striking.
Marshall, we're going to go to questions at 8 o'clock.
I'm sorry, and actually, if I may,
go ahead.
Quick addition to that. That said, there is also this other current. We don't excerpt it here, but they were quite aware of the things that I mentioned earlier: the immigration laws, Jim Crow laws, the privileges that white people had, and the endemic anti-Semitism. And they did cite those things and claim to be truly American. And so, while some of the stuff, the George Washington, is completely made up, et cetera, some of it they grabbed certain threads of truth and wove something else out of that. So.
And you see the utility of pulling from different threads. When I spent my years with white nationalists, they would actually do the opposite thing. They would pull from Greece and Rome and say that we're the descendants of the Greeks, we're the descendants of the Romans, even though Richard Spencer is like English and lives in his mom's basement now in Montana, actually. Something that strikes me in Marshall's film is the American iconography. In the same way that Charlottesville was sort of European, they were using torches and doing Nazi salutes. This feels sort of like an inversion of that it's like an American Nazism that totally left my head spinning. Did that intrigue you as a filmmaker, and how did you think about playing with those symbols?
You're saying with the American icon.
The huge George Washington and the flags, and I have never seen those images and symbols intermixed in that way before.
I think one of the things I was trying to do with the edit was to create a series of questions that then get challenged, and so it begins. It's called A Night at the Garden, and you're like, oh, I wonder what this is. You see a crowd at Madison Square Garden. Maybe it's about a hockey game, and out on the board in the front, it says, hockey game tomorrow, pro-America rally tonight. You're like, oh, I guess there's going to be a pro-America rally. And you see it, and here are people with American flags, and there's George Washington, and wait, but is that a swastika there? And then somebody takes the stage, and you think, oh, well, you're trying to remember what year this thing was, and oh, maybe this is before people knew what the swastika stood for, right? So, and then he says, we want a Gentile-controlled, United States free from Jews, and you think, wow, that's pretty bad. But maybe this is just like pageantry and all talk. But if there were actual violence, people would react differently. And then a Jewish protester from across the river comes running out on stage and is beaten to a pulp and thrown off the stage, and the crowd cheers and laughs. And you think, oh, no, this is not that. And so that's sort of like giving audiences a hope that maybe there's an explanation for what they're seeing, and then undercutting that was part of the way that I was trying to edit it.
Yeah, it's so effective. I want to save time for audience questions. We'll probably get to them at maybe 8:05. You can go to the next clip so that we can keep moving. It's incredible to me that was the heyday of summer camp. It was also the heyday of Jewish summer camp in the Catskills. There were thousands at the time happening. Can you talk a bit about the importance of youth? I mean, of course, there was the Hitler Youth in Germany, and they were obviously priming the next generation. How were they trying to indoctrinate them, and what was the hope? I mean, was there ever any real aspiration or belief that they could take over this country, or were they just trying to organize a militia? What was the hope with these camps?
I think for some people, and Kuhn might have been among them. We don't know for sure, but as we mentioned, on a good quote unquote day, I would imagine that he wondered what would happen if the Reich won the war, if Hitler won the war, and would he be positioned, and would there in fact be a 1,000-year Reich? What would happen to America? Would he become the American Führer? I think that, you know, to the extent there was a rational calculus there, I think that might have been it, and that these camps were indoctrinating centers. These were places to teach these ideals to the next generation. I think what's interesting, the footage of the camps, and there's more of it in the film, is pretty striking. And a lot of it was shot by the Bund itself, and I think in many instances as essentially promotional films for potential parents who might want to send their children to this camp. So just like one might, you know, do I want to send my kid to this Jewish camp or to this YMCA camp? Well, here's a camp video to see if it looks good. This was kind of what they would do. And in other instances, they were probably filming it for posterity, just to have a record of the movement and what they were doing. But a lot of the footage when the Bund collapsed, when the United States entered the war, and later in the film as we explored, the organization went defunct, the footage was taken over by the US government and ended up, as did much of Marshall's footage, but in the National Archives. And so it's kind of interesting to see the degree to which they wanted to document this, both for prospective parents and or for posterity and history. But I think their game was, in some instances, to teach these kids to take over in the future. But not everybody necessarily believed that. And some people, for many, it was also a cultural transmission. German Americans were the largest immigrant group in America, along with the Irish. And just like Jews might want to send kids to Jewish summer camp to teach them values and culture, or any other group might, some of these attendees wanted that as well. And the ideology was part of the package.
And when you're in Yorkville today, you still see traces of it. There's still some German delis, and but the group has become much more assimilated, obviously, in the past 80 years. In the interest of time, I think we can go to the last clip. There's just one more. Totally bonkers. Glad there's no Nazi town on Long Island anymore. As we got it, you know, the rally happened, I think, about 8 months before Germany invaded Poland and the Second World War started. Can you talk a bit about how the German American Bund, the perception of them changed as the war started? Did they become less popular? And what happened to the members? Did they continue to proudly operate? Did they try to acclimate back into American society? That can be for either of you guys.
Yeah, I mean, once America started fighting Germany and German soldiers started killing American soldiers, there was a lot less tolerance for rallies with swastikas that were talking about how great Germany was. So I think the group very quickly lost support. And you can talk a little about what happened to Fritz Kuhn in particular, but, well, yeah, you want to?
Yeah, and I think, so it was no longer cool to be marching around in a Nazi uniform if it had been a year or two or three before, as Marshall says, so I think for obvious reasons. But, and then there were certain laws, wartime laws, specifically something known as the Smith Act and a few others, that allowed the government to actually go after Kuhn and others in ways that they hadn't been able to go after him during peacetime. And he was ultimately caught up at the rally, the Madison Square Garden rally. He had sold merchandise, the Bund had sold, which they were always doing. And it turns out, in an Al Capone twist, that he hadn't paid taxes on the income from the merchandise at the event, among other things. And so there was $14,000 of unaccounted for whatever. So they jailed him for this, first up at Sing Sing. Then when he came out, they had, by then, America had entered the war, and this act had been passed, the Smith Act, and so he was deported as an unregistered agent of a foreign government. And that was something that they probably would not have been able to do earlier. But I heard somebody clap, which is interesting, and Marshall and I were discussing this earlier. Marshall, do you think he should have been deported? No, but it's an interesting question about what you were saying earlier.
No, I mean, we've talked before about, on one hand, I feel happy that America was able to go after this guy, and I'm glad that he, was deported and in fact stripped of his American citizenship. And yet, I do have to say there's some part of me that feels a little bit uncomfortable with the idea of stripping somebody of their citizenship because of their ideology, as loathsome as that ideology might be. So anyway, it's a complicated.
That's a larger debate, but it's an interesting question.
It is interesting.
Right, and it does. We touch on in the film, we're not probably now tonight, but the questions of free speech, a lot of the questions that were brought up by the Bund and at this time are still with us today in very similar ways.
It was pretty amazing to go back. If you have subscriptions to the New York Times, they have a Wayback Machine that allows you to search their archive, and so it's called the Times Machine on the website. And to go back and read the articles when this was happening, there was a very loud debate in New York City at the time about whether this rally should be allowed to happen. And there were leading Jewish groups that said these people are anti-democratic, they're anti-Semitic, but in America, the difference between America and fascist Germany is that in America, even idiots get to say what they think. And Mayor LaGuardia said, this is the biggest assemblage of international cooties that we've ever had in our city, but the way that you kill cooties is with sunlight. And so on the other hand, there were people who said, okay, it's one thing to say the government shouldn't restrict people from saying things, but should they be allowed to rent Madison Square Garden as their platform, which I think is similar to sort of the layers of complexity about free speech on campuses and things today, where people say, okay, you can say what you want, but can you say it from the stage of the main auditorium? And anyway, it's very shocking to me, and how many of the arguments that we are having today about the press, about immigrants, about minority religions, about people taking power, about democracy, about all of these things, about free speech, are debates that we were having 80 years ago in New York City. And maybe that says, I can't believe we're not better. Maybe it says that these are complicated human challenges, and we need to engage them. And I mean, I think there's so much to be depressed about when you study this history, but there are a couple of things that give us hope. And there's a guy who ran out on the stage that night and faced down 20,000 American Nazis, and his name was Isidor Greenbaum. He was a plumber, 20-something-year-old plumber who came over and just heard what was happening and said, I can't leave that unanswered. Ran out on stage, got beaten up, arrested that night, had to pay a $25 fine the next day. And in the New York Times, you can find the reports of what happened. And the magistrate said to him, don't you realize somebody could have been hurt by the disturbance that you set off last night? And this is 1939. He said, don't you realize that somebody's going to be hurt by what's happening in that room? And years later, afterward, he ended up joining the Army, and there was an article that we found in Stars and Stripes magazine about the guy who had taken on Fritz Kuhn, and there's a picture of him sort of, holding up a fist. And years later, there was an article where somebody asked him, how did you, why did you do it? Like, why did you run out on stage that night? And he said, it just seemed sort of, well, hearing what I heard, what would you have done?
Yeah.
And most people would have done nothing. And there's something about that line. Well, it just seems so obvious. What would you have done? That really caught me and made me think, what are we doing?
Yeah, and it was also the heyday of Jewish mob and Jewish boxers, and it's a part of Peter's film. I encourage all of you to watch the full film, and I felt very proud seeing that there were boxers taking to the street fighting these Nazis. This is my last question, and then we'll go to the audience, is, we are living in this moment of exploding interest in white nationalist groups, white nationalist violence. We saw Charlottesville, the shooting in Pittsburgh at the synagogue, in New Zealand at the mosque, and many other instances. do you see a direct line in the ideology between this group and the groups now, or do you see them as distinct?
Well, can I very briefly, I mean, my film is a film about the German American Bund, which is a discrete organization, and you asked at the beginning, who is this guy, Fritz Kuhn, and there's part of me that wants to leave him under his rock, you know, historically, like, really, let's all put millions of eyeballs on this guy who was largely lost to history. But the reason to make this film, to my mind, and to answer your question, I think the Bund matters sort of as this particular organization, but to me, the really interesting thing is this group was one of arguably hundreds, probably between 100 and 200 right-wing groups in the 20s and 30s in America with all kinds of pretty out there right-wing, sometimes fascist, other times just extreme right views. And we have a little montage in the film, we don't see tonight, but of people who belong to some of these groups that you've almost certainly not heard of. They're pretty obscure, but they were out there and they were wearing costumes. It looks like Halloween in some instance. And to me, I just stopped dead in my tracks, because when one sees January 6th, and I was like, why is this guy wearing horns? Why is he dressed like a Viking? Why is, you know, it's not my scene, and I was a little, you know, I know you're an expert, but I was a little puzzled by it. And then what was just striking was in 1930 to excavate all of these photographs, and I'm like, why is this guy dressed like a pirate and carrying a rifle? Why is this person, you know? And so there's a real through line, to my mind, for these kinds of ideas getting traction in America and popping up in different ways. And I think there are two conclusions from that. One is, oh no, this is a big problem, this is deep and real. The other more positive spin, which I sometimes take from it as well, is we've been here before. As shocking as all of this is, and there are of course differences, I'm not saying everything is equal, but a lot of these things, even the deep questioning of whether democracy is our future, that was in the air in the 1930s. This is not the first time. It's the first time in my lifetime, certainly, and that's not to make light of it and say, oh, no big deal, we've been here before, but rather perhaps to say, we've been here before, and is a different path, but here we still are, and democracy did win. And there were hundreds of different groups with people dressed in really scary costumes saying scary things, and people like Isidore Greenbaum pushed back, and other people that we looked at in the film. So I think there is a through line, but I think what one takes as a conclusion from that is perhaps not all negative.
And just to underline what you're saying, it was not that we've been here before and not to worry about it.
Right.
The reason that we went left and not right, or up and not down, was because of the tireless work, sacrifice of a lot of people
100%.
To push the culture
and
in
that's
that direction.
the same with the first, the freedom of speech question. It's not enough, to my mind, not to preach, but to say, yes, I support freedom of speech, and then go home and sit on the couch and watch Netflix all night. It's like, if you're going to preach this freedom of speech, that's excellent, and then you have to get out there and be Isidore Greenbaum, arguably, or Dorothy Thompson, who we profile in our film, who's another hero we won't get into. But there are a number of people, Rabbi Weiss, you know, people who stood up when it mattered. And push back on the other side of free speech to counterbalance the nasty stuff.
All right, let's go to the audience. I think we have note cards. Have you considered making a film about the protesters outside Madison Square Garden during the night at the Garden?
I've not. I mean, we found some footage of them, and the range of numbers estimated of how many were out there are wildly
it's wild,
range. Yeah,
right.
it's from thousands to 100,000, and so there were definitely lots of people who showed up and pushed back. But I haven't. I've thought about including that, but not making a film about it.
Oh, fine. Did the Bund try to infiltrate boy and girl scout troops?
Interesting. Not that I'm aware of, but yeah.
This is a broader one in what we were getting at before, but what do you think is the mass appeal of America First, MAGA, and white nationalism in this moment? Could be for either of you.
Right now, in this moment?
That's what the person's
Well, I
asking.
would just to try and skirt that a little bit and buy Marshall time to come up with an answer. I would point to the history, which I feel
Yeah.
more solid, pontificating about. And America First, as perhaps many people know, is not just a current term. And we explore the America First movement a little bit at the end of our film, which was headed by Charles Lindbergh, who was, Marshall mentioned earlier that Fritz Kuhn was not necessarily the most charismatic American-seeming, all-American kind of guy, apple pie guy, and therefore it probably cost him or limited his appeal. Lindbergh was that apple pie, good-looking, all-American boy. And arguably, there have been many counterfactual histories, Philip Roth and others, that explored the possibility, what might have happened. But Lindbergh ran the America First movement, which, when we entered the war in the in 1939, 1940, and up until Pearl Harbor, I think there were 800,000 members to America First, which was essentially an isolationist movement to keep us out of the war, but was a big tent that also allowed people who had fairly right-wing, even Nazi sympathetic views to be a part of that movement. And there were a lot of pro-German elements to it. And it was the largest nonpartisan political movement in America at the time, i.e. not Democrats, not Republicans, but a standalone thing. And a lot of people speculate that Lindbergh was on track to run for president had we not been bombed at Pearl Harbor and been quote-unquote forced to enter the war. So it's a very live issue, but the America First thing was live back then, and I would just argue that, like these right-wing groups that never really went away, we weren't talking about it during the Clinton era, or while we were worried about prosperity, or while we were worried about the communist threat, quote-unquote, in the 50s and 60s, but none of these things ever went anywhere. And so I think there's a straight continuity for a lot of this for America First and for the MAGA.
Also, I'm not trying to bring in my experience, but I spent years with these groups, and the exuberance that you see in your film resembles what I would see. So I spent 4 years embedded with white nationalist groups all over the U.S., Europe, Russia, Canada, and it is sort of like a social club. Like, they're all friends with each other. They dress the same way. They speak the same way. It's sort of like an insular community that you have to penetrate, that I managed to penetrate. And if you leave, you're not just leaving an ideology, you're actually leaving your whole community, you're leaving your whole identity behind, and that made it very hard for the people that I knew. And in my film, White Noise, there's a female character who deals with a lot of misogyny in the movement, and she hates it, but she can't leave because she'll lose all of her source of income. She makes money on YouTube by being racist and sexist, and all of her friends. So I don't know, something about seeing the film took me back to those terrible years when I would go to those events.
Yeah.
So that part is eternal for sure. Do either of you plan on making more films on this subject in any way, shape, or form?
I don't currently have plans to, no.
I don't either, but I just finished mine, so I'm closer to it, and I always, with every project, and especially this one, it feels hard to let go, and so theoretically, but.
I think that Spielberg optioned Rachel Maddow's book, the podcast, the Ultra podcast. Yep. Yeah. So I believe there is a fiction Spielbergian either series or movie that's in development about that.
This one is complicated, but it's about sort of what I was saying about the flexibility of anti-Semitism. I'm paraphrasing because it's long, but how do you see what Kuhn is saying manifesting today? Are there certain things or language that you're seeing on the street, or the way that people are talking, that remind you of this moment?
Yeah,
it's a tough one.
Oh, I get you. Yeah, I don't know if I have that much more to add than kind of what we discussed earlier, but just the illogic of it all, and the resonance. I mean, this is a random factoid, which I think I sent to you, Marshall, the other day, that I stumbled on. The 1930, this is just in terms of how deep and embedded anti-Semitism was back then, and again, my argument, my rant, is that these things don't necessarily go away as neatly as we might believe. 1939, don't ask me why, I came across the newspaper for the Princeton University student body, and they took a poll in 1939 of the incoming freshman class of who is the quote-unquote greatest man in the world. So this is 1939, they'll graduate in 1943, and the winner by far was Adolf Hitler with 90 some odd votes, plus or minus a few. I can't remember the exact numbers. Second was Albert Einstein, but he had about a quarter to a third the votes that Hitler did. FDR was a distant fifth. So they did the poll again the next year in 1940. So this would be the class of 1944, and Hitler won again. So I didn't go to Princeton, and not to bash on Princeton because it wasn't unique, but I think it belies the sense too, there's a liberal, well-meaning notion that education is the problem. And that if, people just read the books that I did, or they went to a fancy school, or they weren't X, Y, and Z. And the reality is that's not so good. Princeton was considered a good school, and that's not a good look. And fin de siècle Vienna, Vienna in the late 19th century was arguably the greatest congregation of great minds and creative artists in the world, most sophisticated culture, and a generation or two later, you have essentially the Holocaust. So I think it's trickier than just saying we know, or we're educated, and these people are not. I think it is very deep, and I think it is more widespread than one might like to believe. So I offer that just as a random fact that I came across. And I hope that some of it was just youthful contrarianism, and that maybe some of these kids were joking or telling their professors what they wouldn't want to hear or something, but I don't know. I haven't dug into it deeper, but it's a striking number regardless.
Just one last question. Sure. Can you pass the 2 last questions? What was the justification by the U.S. government for not arresting people who were at the rally?
Well, it was not against the law to gather and say what you wanted, and yeah, like we were saying earlier, there was a debate over whether it should be against the law, and the consensus was among most people that the difference between Nazi Germany and America is that even idiots get to say what they want in America.
Yeah, and we touch on it very briefly in our film, but in 35 and 36, the ACLU had a significant case that was brought around one of the camps in New Jersey that we see briefly about whether the local towns wanted to restrict the speech, and the ACLU came in and defended the Bund and ultimately won on free speech grounds.
Yeah, and yeah, even leading Jewish groups were arguing the same thing.
Yeah.
The last one is, I think, somewhat redundant, but do we know how many anti-Semitic or hate groups exist in the current moment, specifically focused on Jews? I will say I know the SPLC keeps account.
That would be for you, I think.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. No, I'm aware. I've had a lot of disheartening conversations recently that I won't get into. And yeah, we're in a moment where the war is being conflated with Jewishness, even though they should be separated. I mean, I think just like from a pure statistical perspective, there are more hate groups operating now, according to the SPLC, than ever before, the Southern Poverty Law Center, than ever before. And I think they started counting in the 70s. And every year it basically increases. I think there's a lot of conflation happening. It's just a very fraught political moment. But someone who exists purely as an American Jew should never be brought into it. And the example I could give is that I screened my film here over the summer about my grandmother, who's a Holocaust survivor, and she would get harassed why she wasn't commenting on the war in Gaza. She's never been to Israel. She's Polish, and she came to America. And her story was about. There you go. But that's the point, right? Is that someone shouldn't have to answer that. Certainly not a 91-year-old Holocaust survivor. I want to end on a nice note. You two are old college friends. What's it like working with your friends? Because I've never had that opportunity.
It's great.
Oh, and I should say that Marshall helped on Peter's film, and Peter helped on Marshall's film.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so it's great. I mean, it's really nice to have people who are good at their craft and will push you to be better at yours, and will tell you the hard truths about things you're working on, and also give you support through the hard times. So
Yeah, ditto. Yeah,
Yeah.
grateful for it.
yeah. And thank you so much
Yeah, thank
for
you.
coming out and doing this, and thanks to this incredible organization for hosting things like this.
Thank you very much.
Two amazing films, and I think you can watch them both online, right? They're available, and share them with your friends.
Yep, so A Night at the Garden is anightatthegarden.com, and there's also links to some of those New York Times articles and Q&As and more sort of background information there. And so, yeah, please, share it with friends that you think would find it interesting. We did, yeah. So
we
yep.
went together.
We went
of
together,
course.
yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Great, thank you again.